Well, everybody, welcome to Lesson 5, Unit 1. Today we're going to be talking about something quite a bit different from the things we've been talking about previously. It is, of course, under the heading of inheritance. But we're going to talk about how all the different rules for inheritance, all of our understanding of chromosomes and so on, leads to populations of organisms changing through the process of evolution. And one of the main forces which drives evolution is an agent called natural selection, and that's going to be our focus today. In this image is, as you can see, some dried leaves, but there's also an animal. And if you look very carefully, you might see it. It is a gecko, and it's not surprisingly called a leaf gecko because it does a pretty good job of looking like a leaf. This is the head. Okay, there's an eye there, there's a nostril, here's one of the arms, there's a leg, there's another leg, here's the back curving around, and this thing here is the tail. One of the questions which leaps to the mind of every biologist when they see such an amazing creature is, how did they come to look so much like a leaf? Now, up until the 18th century and 19th century, the standard explanation for this was that they had been made to look like a leaf. But along came a pair of people, a pair of naturalists, scientists, and they proposed that there was an alternative, a natural process, which drives the organisms of the world to be more and more successful, okay, to become more and more like a leaf, in the case of this particular gecko, or to become more and more streamlined, or more and more aerodynamic, or more successful at capturing sunlight. Whatever the case may be for each organism, this process is going to push them towards that goal. The interesting thing about these two gentlemen, one of whom you will know, this man Charles Darwin is famous, and quite rightly so, is that they had very similar lives in some respects, but also very different lives in many respects. Charles Darwin was born to a wealthy family, not fabulously wealthy, but wealthy enough that he never really had to work for a living. And he was able to attend the finest schools and to obtain the finest of educations. When he left university, he had the opportunity to go aboard a ship, which you see here. This is the HMS Beagle, a trading ship that was about to make a journey around the world. Nowadays, you can make that journey on 1 or 2 plane flights in the course of a couple of days. But in Darwin's time, a journey of this type took years. And Darwin, being a naturalist, someone who loved nature, leapt at the opportunity to explore places which in many cases no one from the Western world had ever been. As a result of which he was able to collect many animals and plants, and whenever he came to a port, he would bundle these things up and send them back to England to various people that he knew so that they could study them. And he became very famous as a result of this, even before he returned to England. This is the route that the Beagle took. She started in Plymouth in 1831, and she made her way south along the eastern coast of South America, around the southern tip of South America, up the western coast to a small group of islands here called the Galapagos, and he made many of his most famous discoveries on the Galapagos. She then made a journey west across the Pacific. There's quite a bit missing here. Landing in New Zealand, making their way to various points in Australia, across the Indian Ocean to the Cape, the southern tip of Africa, back across the Atlantic to South America, and then north again back to Plymouth. And that entire journey, with many stops, as you can see, along the way for supplies and exploration, took 5 years. 5 years. Imagine taking 5 years to do a journey like that. Needless to say, Darwin had lots of time on this trip to collect, as I say, to study, to think. He wrote a book about his travels, which was published upon his return to England. It's called The Voyage of the HMS Beagle, and I highly recommend you read it if you're interested in his life, because it's really a fascinating book. He talks about the people, the Aboriginal peoples of the places where he goes. He talks about the organisms in the places that he goes. And despite being a historical document, it is quite interesting and worth reading. So that was his early life. He then returned home to England, and he spent many years studying all kinds of things, including earthworms, of all things. And he was constantly thinking about the things that he had seen, thinking, and he came up with an idea. Being a man who is fairly reluctant to stick his neck out, he didn't want to publish his idea, but he was forced to do so because he had received a letter from a younger man, and this younger man had sent him a letter saying, Darwin, I've heard about all your amazing travels. I've got this idea. What do you think? And the gentleman who had written him the letter was a man by the name of Alfred Russel Wallace. Now, Wallace was a little bit younger than Darwin, and his family was very poor. As a result, he worked constantly throughout his life, and he had several careers. At some point, though, he settled on being a natural collector. And he sustained himself for many years by traveling the world, collecting animal and plant specimens, and then bringing them back to England to sell. In particular, one of his specialties was butterflies. There were collectors of butterflies in England that were willing to pay extremely high prices for specimens of butterflies from faraway places which nobody else had. Just to give you an idea of how brave this man was, he made a 3-year journey up the Amazon at a time when nobody went up the Amazon, and explored around, met presumably many Aboriginal peoples that lived in this area, collected many types of organisms and brought them back. He was, however, most famous for his travels in Southeast Asia. So here we're looking at the southern edge of what's called Asia. This is Australia down here. So you can see there's this big archipelago, a group of islands, almost all of which are covered by tropical jungles, or were covered by tropical jungles. They're now mostly deforested, but that's a different story. And as you can see, he crisscrossed back and forth from island to island to island over a period of about 8 years, several voyages back and forth. During this time, he again was collecting natural specimens, especially butterflies, in order to make a living. But like Darwin, he was also thinking about the things that he had seen. And upon his return to England, he wrote a letter to a famous naturalist by the name of Charles Darwin. And he said in this letter, I have this idea about how organisms are changing. And sure enough, this is the same letter I was referring to earlier. Darwin had the same idea. And the two of them together presented their idea to the Royal Society, which was the most famous scientific society in England, And so both of them deserve credit for discovering this. They called their idea natural selection. Okay. So what did they see? First of all, Wallace and Darwin noticed that all organisms give birth to offspring, and they pass on their characteristics to their offspring. Now, at that time, they weren't aware of the work of Gregor Mendel, so they didn't know how and why this really occurred, but they knew that parents and offspring resembled each other. Okay, they just didn't know for sure. Mendel's work was discovered after the publishing of this idea. Their second observation was that there are variations in all of the traits of a population. This is, recall, one of the main ideas in Lesson 4. That mutations are constantly creating new alleles that create variation within a population. So it doesn't matter what characteristic you look at, there will be some individuals in the population that are one way and some that are another, some that are in between. There's always variation. Third thing was that some of the variations, some of the features that organisms have, will have an effect on whether that organism survives or not. Okay, so let's imagine an extreme example. Let's say that you're a giraffe and you've got a longer neck. That gives you access to more food because you can reach higher up into the trees than the other giraffes can, and that therefore means you have a better chance of surviving. Okay, so that's an example of how variation could affect your survival, but that's just one of countless possible examples. When you put all this together, you come to the idea that if you are successful, okay, if you have the variations that make you successful, you're going to have a better chance of reproducing. Okay, that is, you're going to have more offspring. And that could be because you're stronger and you've got more resources to collect food and raise your babies. Or it might just be that you survive and you have the opportunity to create babies. As a result of that, you create more offspring, and that means that you pass on more of your successful traits. Okay, remember that parents and offspring resemble each other. Okay, and we know that that's the case because we've studied the work of Mendel. We know that parents pass their chromosomes on to their offspring. Okay, so natural selection causes successful organisms to pass on their successful traits to their successful offspring. And what happens over time, over generations, is that the population will change as a result. Your alleles, your successful alleles, will become more common in the population. And the flip side of that, of course, is that less successful individuals will have fewer offspring, and therefore they will not pass on their unsuccessful traits. And those traits will become less and less and less common. Okay? So think about what the words mean. Natural selection. To select means to choose. Okay? Natural, of course, refers to nature. Nature is choosing the organisms that are successful. Okay? Now, successful means many things, but in the context of natural selection, it means, do you have babies? If you do, you're successful. Let's look at a classic example of this in action. The moth, called the peppered moth, has two different, what are called morphs. Okay? The typical morph has sort of a black and white speckled pattern. That's why it's called a peppered moth. And then the melanic morph has a very dark wings and body. Okay? So there's none of the white. Typically, the typical morph is much more abundant than the melanic morph. Okay? And the reason for that, from our understanding of natural selection, is that moths of this type live in forests And when they are resting, as they like to do, on trunks of trees and branches, they are camouflaging themselves against the bark. Now, typically in a forest where these types of moths live, the peppered moth, the typical morph of the peppered moth with this peppered pattern, is much better camouflaged against these bark patterns. And so here you can see that these moths, most of them blend in, except for this melanic individual here. Okay, so what happens, of course, is that nature selects against this trait. Okay, it is actually caused by a single gene. So this is an allele, which is creating this melanic morph. And it selects against it through natural selection. In this case, the black melanic morph is less successful because it's much more likely to get eaten by birds. Okay? That means that the melanic moths have fewer babies, and that means that their alleles are passed on to fewer individuals, fewer offspring in the next generation. There was an experiment performed on peppered moths without their knowledge, and without humans' knowledge too. And this was done towards the end of the 19th, throughout the 19th and towards the end of the 19th century as industrialization hit Great Britain. Certain cities like Manchester here became massive industrial centers, and as you can see, they produced enormous amounts of pollution. These billowing smokestacks here are not like the smokestacks that we have in our area, which are mostly steam. This is soot from burning coal. Okay, it's nasty, nasty stuff. It settles out all over the city and makes it grimy and gross. But it also, of course, spreads into nature. And what started to happen was the forests started to get quite literally covered in soot. Okay, so the trunks of the trees, instead of being white with pale colored lichens on them, became black and gray. Okay. This meant that the melanic morph, the dark morph of the peppered moth, was now more camouflaged. It was now better camouflaged. Okay. And that in turn meant that the typical peppery morph was now less camouflaged. And so natural selection started to select against the typical morph, again, through the only mechanism that it has, and that is to remove those individuals from the population so that they don't reproduce. In this case, they're being removed, again, by birds. Okay, so predation is the mechanism that controls that. The melanic morphs have more babies, they're more successful, so they pass on more of their melanic alleles, and the offspring get more and more dark over time. Okay, so what naturalists noticed by the end of the 19th century is that the melanic morph was suddenly much more common than the typical morph. This process, I'm happy to say, then reversed itself again when pollution control started to be introduced. The tree trunks went back to their typical color, and the melanic morph became less camouflaged again. Okay. Before we leave this topic, let me just make it really clear as I possibly can, what's happening here. Natural selection acts by making successful alleles more common within the population. And what causes this are a variety of factors which are called selection pressures. So selection should make you think of natural selection. Indeed, that's where it comes from. And then a pressure is something that forces something. So if you're pressing on a door, you're forcing it closed. Okay, if you're applying pressure to someone, it means that you're trying to get them to do something. So let's use the example of the peppered moth. Okay, in this case, the selection pressure is the bird. Okay, the selection pressure is the predator, and whether or not it can see the moths. Okay, So here we have a graph of the abundance of the alleles. Okay, so the orange line represents the typical peppered morph allele. The blue line represents the melanic dark morph allele. Okay. So what they started to see when pollution became more and more abundant is that the typical allele got less and less common. Okay, why was that happening? Well, the birds were eating them. Okay, the more the typical moths they ate, the less common the typical allele was in the population, because they weren't able to pass on those alleles to their offspring. Okay. And the reverse was also true. These melanic morphs being more successful were having more babies, which were more melanic, and the end result is that the alleles became more and more common. Okay, that then reversed itself, remember, once the pollution was removed. Okay, so that's natural selection. If any of this doesn't make sense, and the way I've explained it doesn't make sense, please make a note of it. Ask me in class. I'd be happy to clarify. Natural selection causes organisms to have what biologists call adaptations. An adaptation is any feature that an organism has which allows it to be successful. Okay, in other words, an adaptation is something that natural selection is going to be encouraging, because the more successful you are, the more natural selection is going to be favoring you. So here's an example of an anatomical adaptation. Here we see a monkey. This monkey is what biologists would say arboreal. It lives in the trees. So it has a tail capable of wrapping around branches and holding on. That's called prehensile. That's the word. And it also has hands and feet with grasping toes and fingers, so that it can grab easily onto the branches. Those are examples of adaptations that make this organism successful. The better it is at grabbing onto the tree branches, the more successful it is, because it's going to be able to move around more freely and collect more food and have more babies and so on and so on. Natural selection, remember. Another example of an adaptation is a chemical feature that an organism might have. This is a frog that lives in Canada. It's the northernmost population of frogs. Frogs, as a rule, don't really like to be cold, and that's because their bodies are sort of soft and wet, and they don't freeze well. Okay, if I was to take an organism, let's just draw a name out of a hat. Let's take Schwab and put him into a freezer. If I froze him solid and then pulled him out and thawed him, do you think it would still be a Schwab? The answer, unfortunately, is no. It would just be a pile of goo, okay, organic goo. And the reason for this is that when ice crystals form, they grow, and they would destroy, they would stretch apart and rip all of the cells in the organism apart. And the end result is that when that organism then thaws and the ice crystals go away, all of the cells in their body are destroyed. Okay, and there's no way to come back from that. You're dead. So this particular frog, it's called a wood frog. It, as fall approaches, it begins to produce a compound in its blood, which is very similar to antifreeze chemicals, which are introduced into automobiles to prevent them from freezing. It's a kind of sugar. And what this chemical does is it prevents the ice crystals from becoming large. Ice still forms, but instead of forming big single crystals, it forms lots of small crystals. Okay. The frog then burrows down into the ground, and in the wintertime it freezes completely solid. It is just a lump of ice. Okay. In the fall and into the winter it's frozen, and then in the springtime it begins to thaw out and goes right back to being a frog. Okay. It's a truly amazing adaptation. Allows it to live in an environment which other frogs can't survive in, purely by being able to prevent the formation of ice crystals. And then finally, adaptations can come in the form of behaviors. Okay? Behaviors are really important in terms of how an organism can be successful in its environment. Here's an example from our own part of the world as well. This is a caribou herd. Caribou have a behavior where they migrate in the wintertime to southern areas of their range. And then in the summertime, they head back north again to take advantage of the northern winter, or northern summer, I should say. So that simple behavior allows them to gain more food throughout the year and makes them more successful than a group of caribou that did not migrate. Okay, so those are all different kinds of adaptations. Chemical, structural, behavioral, all things that organisms can use to be successful in their environment. We're almost done here. I need to introduce one more topic. Radiation is a term that most people know about, but they don't really know what it means. It means something that spreads outwards in all directions. To radiate means to spread outwards, and that's why it's called radiation. Okay? We think of things like X-rays as being linear, but if I was holding an X-ray source in my hand, it would be shooting out X-rays in all directions, including into me. Okay? And that's because it's a form of light. So when you turn on a light bulb, I hope you all know, light goes out in all directions. Okay? It is a form of radiation. Why am I telling you about light? Well, the concept I want you to understand is called an adaptive radiation. Why is it called this? Well, the term adaptive should make you think of adaptation, and then radiation should make you think of spreading outwards in all directions, like light does. This is a phenomenon where you get a single species, an ancestor species, arriving in an environment. Usually it's a new environment created by some sort of geological or geographic change. And then it then adapts and evolves into a wide variety of different jobs within that environment. Okay, and the job that an organism has in an environment is called its niche, if you didn't know that. There's the term here, niche. A classic example of this is a group of fishes called cichlids. This portion of Eastern Africa is what's called a rift. Okay, so underneath here, the plates of the earth are splitting apart. And as they do that, this area is slowly sinking. So at the end of the last ice age, an area formed and it flooded with water, creating a brand new lake, actually a series of lakes along this rift valley. And cichlid fish came into these lakes from the Nile, which is this river getting up here, and the Congo, which is coming here. Two enormous river systems. And in that lake, probably one single or perhaps 2 or 3 species of cichlids arrived. And they adaptive radiated out to form over 300 species of cichlids, of which only a handful are shown here. Okay, all within this single lake. So the ancestor species arrived in the lake, and it was able to evolve, it was able to adapt and radiate out to fill a wide variety of niches that were available in that environment. So this is called an adaptive radiation. This is just one example. You can look up many others if you're curious about it. Final thing to say about this is that natural selection, adaptation, are processes which are continually applying selection pressures to populations. If a population cannot adapt, or if it's faced with a pressure that it cannot overcome, so to speak, which it cannot adapt to, then that population faces what we call extinction. That is, it's completely removed from the ecosystem. So This is a picture of dinosaurs. As you can see, dinosaurs were tremendously successful. They were the most important large land vertebrates for 150 million years, which is an incredible run for any group of organisms. However, at the end of that period, at the end of the Cretaceous, they were presented with some kind of environmental change which they could not adapt to. Okay, almost certainly part of that extinction was the collision of a massive asteroid with the Earth, which would have had massive environmental consequences. So because they couldn't adapt to the changes in the Earth, they died, they went extinct. Okay. So extinction is the result for any species that cannot keep up with natural selection. Natural selection and extinction work together, and they shape the evolutionary history of all organisms. One of the things that most people don't understand about evolution is that it's not a straight line. And it's not, the consequences are not inevitable. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean, if we were to start evolution on planet Earth all over again from scratch, from bacteria, the chance that we would be sitting here as talking monkeys is extremely small. Okay, it's much more likely it would be, I don't know, a talking bird or an octopus or something like that. Just to give you an idea of what I mean, here's a little tiny piece of the evolutionary history of horses. This starts down at the bottom here in about, what's the Eocene, about 40 million years. Okay, all the way up to today. And this area that's colored brown is forest habitat. And in the Eocene, Oligocene, and into the Miocene, the planet was very warm. So tropical jungles, like what we see now at the equator, would have covered most of the Earth. And horses began as small, dog-sized animals that lived in these tropical rainforests. Over time, they got bigger, but they stayed within the rainforest, and you can see all these different horses, these little boxes. Okay, all these ones, by the way, that end go extinct. So there's an extinction there, there, right, and so on. As the Oligocene changed into the next period, which is called the Miocene, the Earth began to cool down and dry out. The climate became cooler and drier. And around that time, a brand new kind of plant evolved, and that was grass. Grass did not exist until around this time. And grass was very good. It had a lot of adaptations, using the terminology from today. It had a lot of adaptations for growing in hot, or I should say cool, dry environments. So it very quickly spread, and it formed these massive grasslands. And some of the horses left the forests and went out onto the grasslands, and that's shown by this group out here. All of the forest groups of horses went extinct when the tropical rainforest that they live in died out. The grassland horses began to accumulate adaptations that would allow them to feed on grass, one of the most important of which is that their teeth became very complex, because grass, one of its adaptations to protect itself is that it produces little tiny particles of glass, like window glass. And so if you chew on grass regularly, like a horse would if it was feeding on grass, it wears your teeth down, and then you die from starvation. So horses evolved teeth that were much more complex and much tougher so that they could feed on it. They also, as you can see, if you can look here, they changed their feet. Okay, and they got rid of all the toes that they didn't need except for one. And that made their foot very strong and allowed them to run. And running in a grassland is something that you should be doing all the time to avoid predators. So the grassland horses became more and more successful. Some of them, of course, still went extinct. Here's big extinctions all over here. Okay. And out of all those groups of horses, only one genus survived. Actually, only one species of horse survived. And that has given rise to all of the modern types of horses. And the mechanism by which modern horses were created, we'll be looking at in the next lesson. So why am I telling you this story about horses? Well, the reason is that the evolution of horses is not a straight line. All these horses down here were doing the best they could, okay, at being forest horses, but they didn't know that the forest would go away. Okay, evolution has no destination. It has no direction. It is merely a response to nature, to the environment. Okay, and so our presence here on this planet is pure luck. Okay, some people find that horrifying. I don't. I think that that is what makes our existence so amazing. Okay, so wonderful. Because it is so incredibly lucky that we're here talking to each other. And remember that each of us is such an infinitesimally tiny chance of all those alleles coming together in just the right way. Right? That really puts us, I think, into perspective. Puts it into perspective for me. Anyways, okay. Sermon over. What I'd like you to do now, please, if you haven't already done so, you should fill in your notes for this lesson, 1.5. I would also highly recommend, if you're not doing so, you should be practicing. 1.2 and 1.3 have lots of examples of Punnett squares. Remember, we're working towards a Punnett square quiz, so you need to make sure you've done lots of them. Okay. If you're caught up on those and you feel like you got Punnett squares pretty well sorted, I would highly recommend that you start on the review at the end of your workbook and get started on that, a head start on that before the test. Okay. Thank you very much for your attention, and goodbye for now.